The thing about Windsor Castle is that it never lets you forget it's been here longer than everything. Not in a showy way, not the way a museum does it, with roped-off velvet and laminated signs explaining what you're not allowed to touch. Windsor does it the quiet way, the way a very old person sits in a room and doesn't have to say anything for you to understand they've buried people you haven't been born yet to meet. George was 10. He'd been in this building his entire life, in the way that children are in buildings passing through, half noticing, more interested in what was for lunch than in the accumulated weight of 900 years pressing down through the ceiling. He knew the corridors. He knew which floorboards made noise and which ones didn't. He knew the specific echo his trainers made on the stone near the east entrance, a sound like a very small, very unconvincing army. He did not know the Royal Library the way Margaret Willoughby knew it. Nobody did. Margaret had worked in this room for 26 years. She was 61, compact in the way of someone who had spent decades bending over tables. With reading glasses pushed up into grey hair she'd stopped arguing with sometime around 2009. She wore a pale blue conservation coat the colour of old forget-me-nots. And when George was brought into the room that Tuesday morning in October, she did not look up. Not because she was rude, because she was in the middle of something. George stood in the doorway with his aide, Thomas Young, efficient, perpetually holding a schedule, and looked at the room. It was long and narrow and smelled like the inside of a very distinguished biscuit tin. Wooden shelves climbed to a ceiling that had been painted sometime in the reign of someone who'd been dead for 200 years. The light came in sideways from high windows, pale and specific, the kind of light that lands on things like an accusation. There was a large table in the center. On the table was what appeared to be a very sad piece of wallpaper. "That's it," George said. Thomas made a small noise of diplomatic non-commitment. Margaret, without looking up, "That's it." Her hands were moving. George couldn't tell what they were doing. There was a tray of small instruments to her left, brushes, spatulas, things that looked medical and slightly threatening, and she was doing something extremely slow and extremely precise to the edge of the thing on the table. George walked closer. The thing on the table was large, roughly the size of a dining table itself, spread across a surface covered in what looked like blotting paper. It was brown in the way of serious age. Watermarked, warped at the edges like it had tried to curl into itself and been gently, firmly discouraged. There were patches where the paper had gone translucent, thin as skin over a wrist. There were patches that were simply gone. "It's a map," Margaret said. George looked at it again. "Of what?" "Hertfordshire, 1812, agricultural survey." He leaned in. He could see very faintly, in the parts that hadn't given up, lines, faint as pencil under 10 layers of something else. Boundaries, marks that had been deliberate once, the ghost of intention. "Looks ruined," George said. Margaret did look up then. She had brown eyes and an expression George couldn't immediately classify. Not offended, not amused. Something in between that he'd later described to his mother as like when you say something wrong, but the wrong thing was also a little bit right. "It looks like it needs time," she said. "There's a difference." Margaret let him stay. Thomas retreated to a chair near the door with his schedule and his phone and the particular stillness of someone trying not to exist loudly in a room where important things are happening. George pulled a stool to the edge of the table. The tray of instruments was right there. "What's that?" he asked, pointing at a wide, very soft brush with a handle the color of old bone. "Hake brush." "For dry surface consolidation, right?" George said, as though he knew what that meant. "And that, microspatula." "For things that require a microspatula." He pointed at a small glass bottle with a dropper top. "Is that medicine?" Margaret made a sound. It might have been a laugh. "Methyl cellulose solution. It's an adhesive for the lifted areas." "So, also medicine." She looked at him over the top of her glasses. He looked back. "For the map," she said. "Not for people." "Right." He pointed at what appeared to be a small rectangle of translucent Japanese tissue paper, barely visible on the white surface beside the map. "And that, Margaret said, is the most important thing on this table." George examined it. It appeared to be nothing. It appeared to be the near invisible cousin of nothing. The thing nothing sent to represent it at important functions. "It looks like, don't." He closed his mouth. "It's repair tissue," she said. "Tone to match the paper. It goes over the losses, the places where the original is gone, and it gives the image something to rest on, something to bridge to. George looked at the piece of near-nothing. It's very small, for now. Margaret worked and talked the way people do when talking is how they think, not at George. Exactly, more beside him, like he was a lamp she'd gotten used to having on. She told him about water damage, how it wasn't a single event, but a slow betrayal. A leak probably, decades ago, maybe longer. The map had been folded, stored somewhere it shouldn't have been, and the water had come in and done what water does. Found every crease, every weakness, moved through the fibers like it owned them. The ink lifts, she said. The paper becomes acidic. The structure loses cohesion. And then you get, she gestured at the translucent patches, the missing areas, the parts that were simply no longer there. Gone? George said. Gone? She agreed. But not all of it. That's the thing people get wrong about damage. They see the loss and they call the whole thing ruined. But look, she pointed with the microspatula. Very carefully, not touching. These field boundaries. Still clear. This road, you can see it. The ink here is iron gall. It bonded with the paper fibers differently than the brown wash, so it held. And these marks in the corner. George leaned in, small, cramped, handwritten. Not printed, written. Whose handwriting is that? Margaret set the spatula down, just for a moment. That, she said, is what I find interesting. She had done her research before the map arrived. She always did. The library had a provenance file, a thin one, in this case, and she'd read it 3 times. The map was not a commission. It was not an official survey produced by a gentleman farmer with money and acreage and a name that appeared in debrets. The cartographic style, the way the fields were divided, the specific notation system for drainage channels matched the period. But the hand was not professional. Not trained in the formal cartographic method of the day. Someone taught themselves, Margaret said. George was quiet. For him, unusually, the annotations in the corner are crop notations. What was planted, in which field, in which season? Rotation records. Someone was trying to understand how to manage land they, she paused, didn't own. How do you know they didn't own it? Because of what they wrote here. She pointed to the bottom edge. Faint, almost gone. George squinted for remembering what was ours before it wasn't. The library was quiet enough that the clock on the far wall was audible. George read it again. Oh, he said. Margaret picked up the hake brush. Yes, she said. Oh, his name, as far as anyone could trace it, was William Croft. Not a name in any great record, not a name that appeared in the local landowner registries of Hertfordshire in 18112, but in the parish records, which Margaret had found through a conservator colleague who specialized in ecclesiastical documents and owed her a favor, there was a William Croft, agricultural laborer, listed as a tenant on a farm near Hitchin. Tenant, not owner. So he drew a map, George said, of land he was farming, that he'd been farming most likely for years. His father before him, probably. But it wasn't his. No. And then what? Someone took it. Margaret applied the smallest possible amount of methyl cellulose to the edge of a lifted section. Her hand did not shake. It was not the hand of someone who shook. Enclosure acts, she said. Do you know what those are? George had a tutor. His tutor had covered this. He assembled what he remembered with the careful uncertainty of someone building with pieces he was not entirely sure fit together. The government let landlords take common land that farmers had been using, more or less. Between roughly 1750 and 1850, something like 6 million acres of common and open field land in England were enclosed, fenced off, privatized, removed from the people who'd been working them for generations. It was legal. It was also, she stopped. Devastating, George said. She looked at him again with that expression he couldn't fully classify. Yes, she said. Devastating? George looked at the map, at the field boundaries drawn in a hand that had taught itself, at the crop notations, at for remembering what was ours before it wasn't written at the bottom in ink that had spent 200 years trying to survive. William Croft had made a record of something no one was going to give him a record of. He'd done it anyway. He'd folded it up and put it somewhere in a wall, as it turned out, in a farmhouse near Hitchin that had been renovated in 2019 by a couple who bought it not knowing what they had in the cavity between the old plaster and the stone, and it had stayed there, 207 years waiting for Margaret's table. George asked the question around 11 o'clock. while Margaret was doing something painstaking to the corner annotation that involved a brush the width of a single hair and the focused expression of a person diffusing something. Why is it here in the Royal Library? Margaret finished the stroke, set the brush down, straightened up slowly, in the way of someone whose back was aware of its own history. The family who found it, the ones who did the renovation, they didn't know what to do with it. Local archive didn't have resources to conserve it properly. It had already been to 2 people before it came here. But it's not royal, is it? It's not from the collection, no. So why? Because the library accepted it on long-term loan for conservation, because sometimes institutions can do things that other institutions can't. She picked up the hair-thin brush again. And because Dr. Harrington, who runs acquisitions here, has a small pause, the kind that contains an opinion being politely housed, enthusiasm for what he calls the overlooked record. Documents made by people who weren't supposed to be making documents. George thought about this. People who weren't supposed to, farmers, women, servants. People who had no formal education in the thing they were doing but did it anyway, because they needed to. She applied the brush. William Croft had no training in cartography, but he understood his land better than any professional surveyor who'd ridden through it on a horse for 2 days ever could. He knew where the drainage failed in wet winters. He knew which field went sour after too many seasons of the same crop. It's all in here if you know how to read it. George looked at the map differently than he had an hour ago. It was still brown, still damaged, still full of absences, but the absences had edges now. The places where the paper had given way weren't just holes, they were where the water had found the folds, the places where William Croft had pressed hardest on the creases when he hid it. The map had been handled, hidden, preserved on purpose by someone with no resources and considerable determination. He knew someone might want it later, George said. Margaret said nothing for a moment. I think so, yes. Is it valuable? George asked. Like, monetarily? Margaret made the sound again. Definitely a laugh this time, just compressed. To the right person, she said. To agricultural historians, it's quite significant. The level of detail in the crop rotation notations isn't common for this period from a non-professional source. To social historians, the annotation in the corner is, she paused, chose her word, considerable, as a piece of evidence about the human experience of enclosure. But not Rembrandt. No, I wasn't going to say Rembrandt. You were thinking it. He had been thinking it. The point, Margaret said, is not what it's worth. The point is what it is. It's a man's testimony. In the only form available to him. She pressed the tissue repair gently into a loss at the map's western edge. Every document in this library that people consider important, the letters, the commissions, the records of great decisions made by great men, they all had resources. They had secretaries and archivists, and people whose entire job was to make sure the record survived. William Croft had a wall. The library clock ticked. Outside the high windows, October light moved on the stone. And it worked, George said. Margaret straightened up, looked at the map. It worked, she said. It was 1:30 when Margaret said it. George had eaten a sandwich Thomas had produced from somewhere with the quiet competence of a person who always had sandwiches available. Margaret had eaten nothing, which seemed to be standard, though she'd drunk 2 cups of tea without appearing to notice she was doing it. They'd been working, she working, George watching, asking occasional questions, being corrected, asking again for nearly 4 hours. He'd gotten the names of most of the tools right by now, only mostly wrong on the methylcellulose, which he kept calling the glue medicine, which Margaret had stopped correcting him on after the 4th time. The map had changed since morning, almost invisibly. The lifted corner was down. 2 small areas of loss had repair tissue bridged across them, toned to match the aged brown of the original, almost undetectable. The faintest evidence of work that had been done correctly, which was to say, work that had tried not to be visible. George was looking at the western edge, near the largest area of loss, when Margaret said, "Would you like to do something?" Thomas looked up from his chair. George looked up from the map. Something? What something? Margaret was at the tray. She picked up a piece of toned tissue, larger than the others, cut to a shape, prepared beforehand. "This loss here," she pointed. a gap roughly the size of a playing card where the paper had simply given up. I've prepared the tissue, I've toned it, I've sized the edges. All that's left is to lay it down. She held out the piece of tissue. George looked at it, then at the map, then at her. What if I do it wrong? Then I lift it and we try again. The methyl cellulose is reversible at this stage. She paused for about 40 seconds. That's not very long. No. What if my hands, they'll be fine. You don't know that. I know you've been watching me do this for 4 hours, Margaret said. I know your hands have been perfectly still every time you've leaned over this table, which tells me you understand at some level that the map requires that. She held the tissue out again. I also know that William Croft had considerably less preparation than you do right now. George took the tissue. It weighed almost nothing, less than nothing. The near-invisible cousin of nothing, as he'd thought earlier, gone and come back. Margaret talked him through it, quietly, without urgency. Where to hold it, how to approach the surface, not from above, but from the edge, so it could be placed rather than dropped. How to watch for alignment, how to set it down, and then not second-guess it. Don't press yet, she said. Just place. He placed. The tissue settled onto the loss. It was right. He could see immediately that it was right, that the tone matched, that the edges sat where they needed to sit. Now, Margaret said, the bone folder, very light. Follow the edge. He picked up the bone folder, which he had correctly identified at 10 o'clock that morning as a curved thing for pressing, which Margaret had accepted as close enough and ran it, barely touching along the edge of the repair. The tissue adhered. The loss was bridged. It wasn't invisible. It wasn't supposed to be. Conservation, Margaret had explained at some point during the morning, wasn't about making damage disappear. It was about making loss stable, legible, honest about what had happened to it while being given the support to keep existing. George set down the bone folder. He looked at the map. One small thing where there had been nothing was now holding. He didn't say anything. Neither did Margaret. Thomas, from his chair by the door, made a small sound that might have been him clearing his throat and might have been something else. They wrapped up at 3. Margaret began covering the map, a process involving tissue overlays and a specific kind of breathable cover that took another 15 minutes and involved none of the drama of the morning's work. It was just careful, methodical. The work of someone who had been leaving rooms for the night for 26 years and understood that the leaving was part of the work. George stood near the door with Thomas, who was looking at his schedule with the expression of a man trying to decide whether the afternoon was recoverable. How long? George asked. To finish it. Margaret was smoothing the cover at the far end of the table. 6 months, minimum, possibly 8. The western section needs structural support before I can address the remaining losses. And there are the crop notations in the corner. I want to do those last when the surrounding support is solid. Because they're the most important part. She looked up. Yes, she said. Because they're the most important part. George looked at the covered map, the room, the high windows, the clock on the far wall that had been ticking since before his father's father had been born. Will you? He started, stopped, started again in the slightly different voice of someone asking a thing they've decided to just ask. When it's done, will you let me know? Margaret looked at him for a moment with the unclassifiable expression. I'll let you know, she said. Thomas made a quiet sound of scheduling adjustment. The corridor outside the library was cold in the specific way of castle corridors, which is to say cold in a way that has been cold for centuries and has no intention of changing. George's trainers made their small, unconvincing army sound on the stone. He walked. He thought about William Croft, who had farmed land he didn't own and drawn a map of it in a hand that had taught itself and written at the bottom for remembering what was ours before it wasn't and folded it up and put it in a wall. He thought about what Margaret had said, that William Croft had had considerably less preparation. He thought about the near-invisible tissue, the weight of almost nothing, the 40 seconds of reversibility. He thought about the bone folder running along the edge, the tissue adhering, the loss bridged. He hadn't fixed the map. He hadn't saved it. There was 8 months of Margaret's work away, at minimum, and even then saving wasn't exactly the word. Stabilized, given support to keep existing. But he had done one thing, one small irreversible thing, in a document that had survived 207 years by the determination of a man with a wall and a reason that seemed like enough. Thomas caught up with him at the East Corridor. Schedule restored, afternoon recovered. "Good morning, sir." George thought about it with the seriousness of a 10-year-old who has been given a reason to be serious. "Margaret Willoughby," he said, "calls methyl cellulose solution an adhesive for the lifted areas." Thomas waited. "She's wrong," George said. "It's glue medicine for the map." Thomas considered this. "I'll note that," he said. "You should," George said. "It's more accurate." The East Corridor opened onto the courtyard. The October light was doing its sideways thing, landing on the stone walls with the same pale specificity it had landed on the map all morning, like an accusation, like a question, like something trying to read what was there before it was too late. The castle was still here. The map was still here. William Croft's handwriting, cramped, self-taught, insistent, was still here. George walked out into the light. A note on William Croft. William Croft, agricultural labourer, is listed in the parish records of St Mary's Church, Hitchin, Hertfordshire. Born 1779, he farmed on tenant land near Orton Head Common for approximately 30 years. The common was enclosed in 1816 under a local enclosure act. No further records of his tenancy exist after 1817. The map attributed to him is now under conservation at the Royal Library, Windsor Castle. The crop rotation notations in the lower corner are considered by agricultural historians to represent one of the most detailed non-professional records of open field farming practice from the enclosure period in the home counties. The annotation at the bottom edge for remembering what was ours before it wasn't is intact. Conservation is ongoing. Ed.